Let's get back to our study, shall we? Lesson 12, Dispensations, the Divine Blueprint of History. And of course I have lifted that title off of a book that Colonel Thiem wrote. Hey, if someone says something and says it well, why should I change it, right? My apologies to him. I'm thinking that y'all are probably all still in fellowship since we just finished our last class. However, y'all know the routine if by chance you might have sinned in the last 15 minutes. So let's go ahead and just continue our study. Again, we're in the age of Gentiles, and we have just completed our study of the era of positive volition, and we're now going to look at the era of negative volition. First off, we're going to introduce this subject, the era of negative volition, by looking at several factors. Our first subject, of course, will be sin in the Garden of Eden. And our first question is, just how could perfect beings have negative volition? That is, how could these two perfect people turn away from the Lord in their state of perfection? After all, wouldn't perfection protect you from sinning? You certainly would think so. Now, the answer to this lies in the character of the angelic conflict and to that first divine institution, the individual. We talked about divine institutions some weeks ago, that the individual, the first divine institution, involves that factor of volition, freedom of choice, and mentality. Now first, Satan was perfect. He was also perfect. When he became depraved and revolted against his Creator, Jesus Christ, so the pattern was set. Satan had volition, therefore the ability to reject our Lord. He became preoccupied with himself and took that preoccupation to the nth degree and actually revolted against God. Now for God to resolve this conflict, he took Satan to court, and of course Satan lost, but God, in his graciousness, allowed Satan to appeal that guilty verdict. I believe our justice system has the same mercy built into it. So, God created the human race to duplicate, within certain limitations, the conditions of Satan's fall. So he created the first human beings with volition and mentality. God created both Adam and Isha, the woman, with volition, that is the potential to reject God. They had to have the freedom to do so. Why did God place volition in his created beings? Sounds like an awful hassle, doesn't it, really? All the can of worms that God opened up by giving Satan volition, freedom of choice. He had everything. Well, look at it this way, looking back to our childhood. Just how much fun was it to play with someone who was told they had to play with you? Companionship with someone who is forced to be with you really isn't companionship at all, but slavery, right? Didn't you want to have a friend who came to play with you because they wanted to play with you? Well, God's no different. He wants us to choose him because we want to respond to his love. That's why he gave each one of us volition. God placed volition into each member of the human race as a part of soul volition. As soul function. And he has never taken that away from us. With that, we resolve the angelic conflict. Second question, or second point, just how did God test the first human's volition? How could these two demonstrate the rejection of God's perfect provision for them, which is what they would have had to have done? Genesis 2:17 talks about this. Genesis 2:17 reads this way, "From the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it. For the day you eat from it, dying you shall die." That's the prohibition that our Lord gave to Adam and the woman, or Adam and Isha, in the garden. This is how their volition was tested. Their first issue is, of course, the tree. Trees of all kinds, of course, were given to Adam and Isha in the garden. Trees were there for stimulation of the soul. You ever looked at a beautiful painting? How much that stimulates your soul? How enjoyable it is to look at a painting and analyze the color, analyze the composition, analyze the texture. I was a commercial photographer in Houston. Now, when I was just a budding photographer, this close friend of mine, she's an architect now, living in England, I think, drugged me to the Houston Museum, which really, they had a lot of photography there, and they had this show by a French photographer, shot, I think, during the 20s and 30s, maybe 40s. When was photography invented? I used to know these things. But she went through, and she pointed out to me all the aspects of composition. It opened my eye. You talk about learning to appreciate photography. She taught me a lot about composition that I didn't know. But these trees, certain trees, were put there, probably perfect symmetry, probably color designs. Who knows how God created those original trees? But they were stimulating to look at and to enjoy. Other trees were given to them as food. Oh, I can't imagine. I can't wait to get to heaven and check out some of those tree foods. I bet there was a chocolate tree, pre-sweetened, mocha tree, pick a fruit and squish, a good mocha. I like that. God provided a bunch of trees for them to enjoy and to take care of. And there was one tree called the Tree of Lives, which was given to them in order to develop their capacity for God. God provided everything that the human race would ever need in the garden. These both were also given, both Adam and the woman, were given the potential for immediate capacity to appreciate God's provision. Note the word potential. They had to have the same thing to develop capacity for appreciation of God that we do, and that is doctrine in their soul. Jesus Christ came to talk to them every evening. In the cool of the evening, he walked with them personally and would teach them Bible doctrine. Now, one tree, I imagine it's during one of those sessions, one of those evening walks, where he gave them the prohibition. Now, one tree, which was set in the middle of the garden, was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, first, the tree itself. First of all, there are no grounds whatsoever for believing that this tree was a magical symbol, or that the tree contained, say, some secret enzyme, which would automatically give them a whole gamut of knowledge of good and evil once they ate it. The tree was a symbol, and it was embodied in an actual tree. It was simply a symbol. Just as, say, our communion, you take the bread and the wine, and that bread and wine of the Eucharist are symbols embodied in the bread. And, of course, the grape juice, or if you're in Japan, the wine. We had wine over there. I had my first wine as a kid and communion over there. Didn't like it. Maybe it wasn't good wine. I don't know. I can't imagine not liking good wine. Anyway, in a similar way, the tree of life was also a real tree. Yet it symbolized the fact that life, their life, was a special gift given to them by God. Oh, I can imagine, especially Adam, because he obviously spent some time in the garden without a counterpart, how he would have appreciated the life that God gave to him through Eve, or through the woman. I believe her name was actually Esha before the fall. We can get into that later on. You note that when you approach the communion service out of fellowship, or as Paul says, in an unworthy manner, though there's nothing magical in the communion elements, if you approach the communion out of fellowship, warning discipline, intensive discipline, and eventually dying discipline, same principle, of course, eating this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, in the same way, again, the tree was a symbol to test the first couple's actions. Question, would they obey God, or would they assert on their own volition and go against God's command? Note that this is the only way that they could sin. They could have had knockdown, drag-out arguments, and there would be no sin in that. Their only way of demonstrating their sin, their rejection of God, was to eat of that tree. Now, again, to argue that the tree had some magical power to confer knowledge of good and evil would be to miss this point. The tree was simply a test of the couple's intention to obey or to disobey God. The tree only represents the possibility that creatures that God made in His own image could refuse to obey Him. That tree served as a very concrete expression of that rebellion. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was simply a test. Now let's look at good and evil. Good and evil are Satan's policy. Both good and evil are Satan's policy. When I learned that good was also a part of Satan's policy, I was somewhat surprised. I've always thought good was a good thing. Well, not always. As a matter of fact, probably not most of the time. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Okay, I think that's probably quite true. Sincerity. Folks, there's nothing worse than sincerity. Let's have integrity, not sincerity. How many of these politicians are sincere in their efforts to do these wonderful things for society? Now, again, the tree was forbidden because knowledge of good and evil go along with spiritual death. Upon rebelling against God, they immediately died spiritually and instantly understood the issue of evil, and they applied good. They did both. Good and evil are two things that the human race did not need to have a relationship with God. And they, of course, had a perfect relationship with Him.